All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Odemaya. I'm really excited for today. We're going to keep diving into the series that we started in the first episode, and we have a very fun guest today. Her name is Comfort. And Comfort, I would like you to introduce yourself to the audience.
Hi everyone, my name is Comfort Nyeswah-Wiafe. I'm a
Mhm.
licensed therapist in private practice, and I'm the founder of Equipped to Prosper, a therapy directory for Africans worldwide. And
Yeah.
I'm glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, thank you for coming. Thank you for coming. So, what got you into the mental health field? A lot of Africans don't typically go into it.
I think for me, it was my life experience. It's just growing up, you tend to see so many things and you start to have questions. You
Hmm.
know, why are the people in your community, whether that's your family, your friends, people that you see, why are they wire a certain way, why they behave in a certain way? The more
Yeah.
you talk to people, the more you understand, well, this shouldn't be this way and that shouldn't be this way. And I think for me, that was my drive towards wanting to being in the field is that two people can experience the same thing and the two of them
Yes.
respond and behave completely different.
Yes.
Being in an African community, that was something I saw a lot. And so early on, that was something I knew. Once I learned that there was a way that you could help people, I knew that was something that I wanted to do.
Yes. Yes. Wow. Wow. That's really good. That's really good because for a lot of Africans, trauma is seen as humor. Oh, my mom used a long switch to beat me up the previous day. You go to school the next day and you laugh about it, you
Mhm.
know? But then we get into this field and we see things and we're like, hey, this is not, there's something off about this.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And that thing that's off about it, you know that shouldn't be the norm, but we've normalized it that it's like we can joke about it. And I tend to use the example of there's some people who go to work late all the time. They're always like 15 minutes late, 15 minutes late. They've done it for so long that that has become their norm. But that's not the norm. The norm is to show up to work at 9 a.m. Just because
Mhm.
someone continues to show up 15 minutes late all the time and they're used to it, that does not make it a norm. So just because we got a level of beating, some of us got abused over and over and over, we cannot take that and say now because of this, this is the norm. It's
Yeah.
not. It shouldn't be.
Yes, it should not be. It should not be. And not even just that, like there's the spiritual component in Africa of there's certain mental illnesses that are seen as spiritual curses, like all of these things. Yeah.
I think with spirituality, as Africans, we're heavy on spirituality. We're spiritually inclined, and that's a stretch, is on a spectrum to believing that there's a God, and he oversees all that we do, to we're going to worship this tree or this rock. Like we have that spectrum. And so, depending on how we were raised, we fall into that spectrum, and that spectrum kind of drive how we make decision. Our spirituality, our culture drives how we make decision.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yes. And I mean, I need this for everything. I mean, spirituality drives how we make decisions for marriage. It drives how we make decisions on how we raise kids.
Yeah.
There's a famous thing I used to hear all the time. Spare the rod and spoil the child. Of all the verses in the Bible, that's something that a lot of Africans have focused on as an excuse to keep doing certain things that kind of fuel stuff. But yeah, so
Yeah.
you're right. Spirituality is a big, yeah.
It's a spectrum, and that scripture doesn't end there. That's part of the scripture. So I'm going to charge everyone to go look up that scripture and read the full scripture. And sometimes we miss a lot of things when we don't focus on the context in which we're getting
Yes.
it in, right?
Yeah.
When you look at that scripture, there's a pre-text and there's a post-text, and there's that
Mhm.
text in the middle. So I'm
Mhm.
going to charge everyone to go and read that specific scripture, because we can take, because we hear it, we can take it and we can kind of make that as if to say it's the truth. And
Yes.
because we're talking about Africans and Africa, there's a story of how we kind of take on information that shouldn't be there. Like a mom cooks in a certain pot and say she's cooking fufu and soup or something, and this pot is very small. And then, the daughter is asking, well, Mom, why are you always cooking this pot? She said, it helps to make the seasoning and do all of this and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
You take that story, and when you go all the way back, is that the great grandmother, they didn't have a pot that was big. It had
Yeah.
nothing to do with seasoning, had nothing to do with spices, how the food was
Prices.
going to taste. It's just that the pot was small. But now over the years, is the pot is small because it helped with the taste, and then
Yes.
we're able to take a story.
Wow.
We're able to take a story and kind of stretch,
Stretch
add,
it.
and
Yeah.
exaggerate.
And we mix it over the years, because, even in the verse that you're talking about, like after that, it says, parents do not provoke your children to anger. There's a verse in the Bible that says that. There's so many things that we kind of pick and choose and say, hey, this is what it is, this is what we're going to follow, which then
Mhm.
kind of like moves the whole stigma of mental illness in Africa, going.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And everything that we know today, you and I, and for everyone listening, everything that we know today, we learned from someone.
Yes,
Every single thing that we know today, we learned from someone, something, our experience taught that to us. And so it's really careful to hear something, take it and run with it, and to really be intentional about the information we take on and we make it as truth or we make it
yes,
as our beliefs.
yes, yes. Because I would never forget, as a very young man, I stepped outside of my house one time and I saw a man on the street.
Mhm.
And I'll always remember this because he was barely wearing any clothes. He was all rough and everything. And then he was talking to himself.
Mhm.
And the reaction of everybody around in that street was, if you move anywhere close to him, you're going to catch what he has, right? There was this whole like, oh, it's a demon. And then you have to like really, really, really watch out for it. And then fast forward years later, and I'm sitting down in my psychology class. I'm like, hey, what this man had was schizophrenia. All he had to do, we could have taken him to the hospital, put him on some antipsychotics, do some therapy. He'll be fine. But that stigma has caused a situation where he's stuck on the street and he's, doing all of these things. And that's something that like Africans need to come into awareness about.
Absolutely. And I share this story of me being growing up in Ghana as a child. There was one of the kids in our community that we play with. He was about my age and he had autism.
Hmm.
But everyone was that he was witched. Something happened to his mom when she was pregnant, but he played with us and he had repetitive behavior that he would do with his toys. He would hold like a shoe
Yeah.
with a shoestring and he would spin it and his pacing and like you sitting in
Hmm.
that class and you have this flashback into your experience most of the time in
Yeah.
your African household, in your African community, back home in Africa, and you're like, we missed this. And
Yes.
it's amazing to think all 54 countries in Africa that have experienced devastation are mentally well and okay. I
Yeah.
charge people when they come across, they'll see your content, they'll see my content, and they want to push back. Well, mental health is for the other people, it's for that group of
For
people.
people.
How in the world, with the continent that we live in, that have experienced so much,
Mhm.
have not yet struggled mentally?
Yes.
It's mind blowing to me that people think that people believe that. And there's grace on that because some people don't know what mental illness is.
Yes.
We have to do more work in getting the education out there. If anyone were to be injured on their shoulders, on their leg, we will see.
Yes.
If I were to have a mental injury, you will not see unless I'm displaying, like you, schizophrenic behavior, like when you saw the man in the neighborhood, or I'm displaying an emotional behavior symptoms for you to see. So our mental injuries is not always visible. And
Yes.
so that's a way in which to get a lot of us to understand. It's impossible to think a human being can go from 1 years old to 90 something years old and not have a mental injury. And so
Injury.
for me to really get the African community to understand it, now I say mental injury, which is the same as the physical injury.
Yeah. I like that. Using that, kind of, puts a lot of perspective, because a lot of people, um, again, cannot cannot understand that just because you cannot see it does
Hmm.
not mean it does not exist. There was a gentleman I came across. He was from Sudan, back in the war. He moved to the United States on asylum, and he talked about his experience. And in my head, I'm like, okay, there is no way you're not experiencing PTSD. You watch your parents get blown up into
Hmm.
pieces. Like there is no way. And then in time, he will act like he's fine and everything. In time, I got to understand that he had nightmares every day. He had hypervigilance. He had avoidant behaviors. He had all the symptoms of PTSD, but did not recognize it as PTSD. He recognized it as something that he needs to pray away, you
Hmm.
know? And
Yeah.
that's where a lot of confusion comes in. It's like, okay, hey, but it's for some people, spirituality may help, but it
Hmm.
doesn't help for other people because it's almost like a band-aid on a really, really dangerous wound.
Yeah. I think that if we just focus on spirituality when there's a mental injury, we miss the root of the issue.
Mhm.
Um, and I think that as a being, as a human being, we're mind, body, and soul. The soul is the
Yeah.
spiritual aspect. So we don't ever want to leave out the spiritual aspect, but it shouldn't be the only thing we focus on. Just like we don't want to focus on only mental health and leave out the spiritual and the physical. We don't only want to focus on physical and leave out the mental and the spiritual. And so I think for us is that trying to get people to understand you can go through a traumatic experience and not see it as trauma. We understand that. And you're pretty much telling us you don't see this as trauma. We understand that. Now, as you're moving through your day-to-day life, how is that going? And
Mhm.
sometimes, too, you and I know we have to take away the word trauma, PTSD, for people to really understand it. So we're not calling it anything, but
Mhm.
are you having a decent sleep? Are you waking
Yeah.
up? Are you reliving your mom and your parents being blown up in a war?
Wow.
So let's not call it anything. Let's not call it
Yeah.
depression. Let's not call
Mhm.
it anxiety. Let's not call it schizophrenia. What are you experiencing when you go to sleep?
Yes. I
When you
like that.
wake up, can you function? Are you able to eat? All of that. How do you think that is going to help you the next year from now, next 2 years from now? If you cannot get quality sleep, what happens to your work? What happens to your relationship? What happens to your physical health? We no
Yes.
longer call it trauma. We just focus on whatever you want to call it. And
Yes.
so, really breaking it down for our people to understand, we don't have to give it the labels you don't want because we know
No.
that we can
The
over,
labels scare people. The
you
labels,
know,
people are like, hey, no, 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 I'm not bipolar. Oh, no, 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 don't say I'm schizophrenic. No, no. Like, yeah, the labels scare a lot of people.
we can in the Western world, it's extremely overused when it comes to diagnosis. And I think when you are not trying to educate, inform, and inspire, we know that not to use certain label depending on what's going on. And I think for me, it's always important for the person to tell me what they think it is versus me giving them what I think it is.
Mhm.
Um, because even in a therapy room, people know that they have experienced a level of trauma, but they don't call it trauma, they call it trials.
Yeah.
People know they have experienced something devastating in a civil war in Africa, but they choose not to call it that because for some reason that helps their mind. And in that sense, they're engaging in cognitive behavior therapy. They're reframing what was traumatic. So we get it, but we still want you to know that because you're having this nightmare when you go to sleep, because you're fidgety when you're around people, because you can't go into a crowded place because you think this is going to happen. You are reacting to something from your past. We do
Mhm.
not have to give it a label, but just know
Mhm.
that you're being impacted, mind, body, and soul.
Yes. Yes. So, from what I'm hearing you say, like focusing on the symptoms rather than the diagnosis is the best way to handle the stigma.
As Africans, um, especially being in a diaspora, we don't take too kind to people labeling us because we've been labeled our entire existence. You know what I mean? Like from
Mhm.
booty scratchers to whatever it is now, we have been labeled. And
Mhm.
so to now go into a treatment and see a person that don't look like you, that don't sound like you, that don't have the name like you, give you a diagnosis of something that don't make sense to you is wild. So can we focus on the physiological, the psychological, and the spiritual symptoms versus giving it this grand narcissistic name, this
Yeah.
grand antisocial name, this grand PTSD versus your life have not been the same since you watched your parent murdered in front of you. Let's talk about that.
Yes. Yes. I love that. That's a very, very good approach. Because in thinking about the origins of psychology, like you said, and how, in all honesty, the DSM that we use as our mental health Bible in so many words is not really very inclusive. It does
Mhm.
not take into factors cultural things that makes a person a certain way. And so when in addressing these issues with the African diaspora, it's like we can use the template from what was created, but the template is not necessarily useful in the
The people,
population.
the
Yeah.
people.
Hmm.
And I'm about to do one now because I'm about to say it. I get in good trouble all the time. I was
Hmm.
one of the students in class. I was that student in class.
Hmm.
Um, because when you're in school, and I went to an amazing university and had an amazing career due to my education. When you're in school and you see that the people to some degree who are teaching the courses and the classes that are not even factoring in the multicultural aspect, and you only take one class on multicultural, that's mind blowing.
Yeah. Oh
That's
yeah.
mind blowing. A whole curriculum, one
One
class,
class.
cultural, one
Hmm.
semester.
Hmm.
You know what I mean? Where does the person who's from Morocco that used to be a Muslim person converted into Christian, where does that person fit in multicultural counseling in that one
Mm.
class? The
Yes.
person who is from Ghana, who is from Liberia,
Hmm.
who is from Nigeria, that when they're experiencing grief, they have to shave their head because culturally, that is the doctrine they must follow. How does that person fit into that one multicultural class that we took in school? So, because we've been in the field, and you don't get that right away in the classroom, you now start working in the field. You're fortunate to work with enough people, which is an amazing experience, and you realize we're not included in anything.
Hmm.
And we can
Hmm.
speak to African American, Caribbean American, and we know that there's about 5 or less than 5% of Black and Brown in the field. We can
Yes.
go, yes, absolutely, Black and Brown in the field, less than 5%. Where does Africans show up?
Yes.
I was talking to someone not too long ago, and we was talking about discussing some things on contract, and so it's talking about multicultural, being able to be culturally competent, not just putting it on your website,
Yes.
putting it on your website, being able to live that, being able to have train experience in being culturally competent. And the person has said, I think, uh multicultural, being cultural competent, I think that's overrated. I think now we need to focus on humanism and being humble and the person in front of you. And now the person that I was talking to did not have this, my skin
Yeah.
complexion. And
Yeah.
so, but that was a person who was working at a certain level, working with people. If you don't see that, how can you be providing care to people that look like me, sound like me, and like that have my name that you cannot pronounce?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so it is so important, which is why I love that you're doing this,
Oh
because getting
yes.
the word out there is really going to help us get more people in to the psychology, counseling field, social work field, to be able to be inspired to want to get into the field because we have so many Africans that need help.
Oh
They might
yes.
not know it. Some of them know it, but we need so many people that look like us, that sound like us, that have name like us to get in the field so we can give our people the help they need. That's why I started Equip to Prosper.
Yeah. I like that. I like that. Like this, that is something in the past 2 years I've had almost like an awakening because for the very first time in my career, 10-year career, I'm able to serve the population that I came from. There are more
Mhm.
Nigerians and more Africans coming into my office now and saying, "Hey, I need help." And it is just, I mean, it makes me it puts chills on my spine right now because it's been something I've been looking forward to. I've been looking forward to so, 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 so much. Now I can sometimes in some sessions speak pidgin English, you know, to my client, and I can relate. There's a lot of relation there. you know.
Yeah.
But then you look at something like back to what we're talking about, diagnosis, symptoms, you know. If I put a label on a child who grew up in Africa, for instance, I say, hey, you have ADHD, he's gonna look at me like, okay, tell me more. But then you have to think about the fact that this kid grew up in boarding school. And in boarding school in Africa is different from school here. You know, school here, they expect us to sit down still for a very long period of time. In boarding school, there's so many breaks, you know, that he experienced. There's no
Yeah.
unleashing of energy. And then you're saying, okay, hey, because you can't sit still and you're not doing this, so now I'm going to put you on medication. Like, no, no, like we got to and that's one of the things where like I'm now at this space where I'm thinking about ways to create maybe a ADSM, you know, African DSM, you know,
Absolutely.
like
Absolutely.
creating something like that to just really tailor it to certain populations so that we can really address issues.
Yeah. I think that that's powerful because, especially for the African kids, that if they're coming into therapy, we know their parent is the one bringing them in. Their parent needs to have certain knowledge of ADHD,
Mhm.
right? The
Yeah,
ability for a child to be able to comprehend the diagnosis that he's getting, or for the therapist, the provider, to be able to tell this child and explain to this child so the child can understand it. And when we talk about culture, hence why one class in graduate school on multicultural counseling does not speak to the vast different cultures there is in Africa. You know what
yeah,
I mean? So
yes,
it's mind blowing. I think that you and I know people who were the firstborn in the home, or the first, male son, or the first daughter, and now that person as an adult, one can see themselves and think, oh, they have ADHD, and some do have ADHD, but some don't because as a little one they had to do so many things. And so the doing now can mimic what looks like attention deficit or
so
hyperactivity, right? And so being able to, for sure, this is ADHD. This right here is because of how you was raised and you've been wired and conditioned that way. You are still
yes,
adjusting through that. And so I think that's where our African providers come into play because we're able to decipher exactly like you said, this child has ADHD, this other person is a conditioning that they had because they were the first daughter in the home. They were the
parentification.
firstborn son in the home. They've been parentified at an early age. So yes, they look like on the outside from a person who's not African that's meeting this person right away or ADHD. But that you take the time to get into the root of it all to
Yes,
understand that this could not be ADHD. And
yeah,
so we have ways to go with that. And I think to your point of maybe we do need a DSM. Are we going to call it a DSM?
because
Right?
yes,
And so there's that. And I think like we talked about before we got on here, you have some ideas, I have some ideas, and we're all working on something because we know our people need it, and
yes,
it needs to be for Africans by Africans.
hmm
We can have the DSM, probably I think it was the second or the third edition when it came out. There was a diagnosis in there where free slaves, when they used to run away, was considered mentally ill. And it starts with a D, and I can't come up with a specific name now, but if you can find that, that would be great.
yeah,
But when free slaves used to escape their masters, they were considered mentally ill. That was the actual diagnosis in the DSM. And so every year we see the DSM change. People
yes,
that are some of the time making these decisions have now walked the soil that I walked in Ghana,
yeah,
have now walked the soil that you walk in your country. Maybe
hmm
they did for research and they left. They came back to their AC. Maybe they
hmm
did for a sabbatical and they left.
hmm
So again, I get in good trouble.
yeah. I
Im-
mean,
Imagine getting a diagnosis that the research was not based on you, but now you get this diagnosis.
hmm hmm or that like they clump, you know, everything in black, you know,
Mhm.
not understanding that within the African diaspora alone, there are over 300 tribes with 300 different ways of living.
Yeah.
There's several layers of things that like needs to be considered before just saying, okay, let's put everybody under this,
Hmm.
umbrella, Yeah.
Yeah, it's we have ways to go, and the DSM have helped so far, and the DSM has given us a level of format that we can use, and I think that's important to acknowledge. They have helped giving us a level of format that can be used, just like the DSM was taken over from the ICD, the International Classification of Diseases. That's what the
Disease.
DSM was derived from, based on World War II, because veterans was coming back with trauma. It was because of
Trauma.
trauma the DSM was put in place. Now the Africans are in the field, we're seeing it and we're saying, oh no, we need to come up with something that's our own, just like they did when people was coming from World War II. And I think that it's important to know that the DSM serve an amazing purpose.
Yeah.
Does it cover everything about Africans? No. Are they able
No.
to? No, because they are not African, and so it's impossible to do, and we get that, which is why we're here now. The people that will come after us will be able to do that and more. Having a directory like Equipped to Prosper that people can go and find a culturally and spiritually competent therapist was something
Yes.
that I felt like I needed to do.
Yes.
With the work that I've done, the people that I've come across professionally, personally, my own life experience, I want to sit in a therapy room and talk about things that I know, like you said, whether it's pidgin, whether it's colloqua,
Yeah.
whether it's whatever it is, Swahili,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's Francophone French,
Mm-hmm.
that the person in the therapy room can understand the layers of who
Mm-hmm.
this person is sitting in front of me. That's what
Yeah.
the DSM does not give us at this point.
Yes. And that goes to the next question. Like, so in your opinion, so like, how do you think we can get more Africans in the field? Because like the general thing about, you growing up in an African community is you have to be a medical doctor, or you have to do like all of those big stuff. But like, to get people interested, I remember one of the roadblocks I had growing up was, why would you, I'm confused. Why would you want to study psychology? Like why? What are you gonna do with that? So like, how do you feel we can get people comfortable in going into the field?
Yeah. I think what you're doing is one of the best ways to do it.
Hmm.
It's really this. Someone is going to see, what the amazing work you're doing, your podcast, your website, and everything you've done and resonate with that. Someone is going to see what I'm doing and resonate with that. And this is one of the ways to do it. Reaching out to our community for me is being mindful. Not every African person is receptive to therapy. So I
Yeah.
know that I accept it, I receive it. And my goal is not to reach every African, because I know
Mhm.
not every African is going to be receptive to it, just
Yeah.
because of our spiritual and our cultural nature. I respect that. For the ones who are receptive, for the ones who do want to get in the field and need the help, we are here. And I
Yes.
think even just being able to, for us, doing more speaking engagements, doing
Mm.
more media, doing more televised talking, programming, project, and things like that. That's one way for people to be able to get in the field. I think the other thing is more community events that is built around fun, but also tying in the mental health concept, because we know our people love to have fun. If we were to
Yeah.
create just a whole event on mental health, we might not get the level of people we would want to show up there, versus if we were to tie it in with an aspect of fun and then tying in mental health, they will be able to receive that.
Mhm.
Um, I think another thing is you've published your book, right?
Mhm.
There's that, us being able to publish more, write more articles, um, doctors, master levels clinician, doing more research on specific topic, um, that matters to the African community. That's another way. Um, and I think just us being really solid, strong, and not withering in our decisions. Like we get to
Yes.
talk about this now. I come across so many other providers who are not ready to talk about this now for obvious reasons. They'll talk about it in private, but don't want to talk about it on other platforms. And it makes sense. But we see people talking about so many other things that's not helping us. So how can we, as providers in the field, knowing what we know, how can we use our voice in our various platforms? And some of
Hmm.
us do it, but it's in the therapy room, which is
Hmm.
amazing. Some of us do it and it's on a podcast. Some of
Yeah.
us do it and it's on a different magnitude.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think all of those count. I think making our face visible,
Yes.
making our faces visible, making our voices heard is
It- yeah, definitely, definitely, definitely. That's a really, really good stuff. And it's kind of when you're speaking earlier, something came up into my mind about what a diagnosis. You're talking about firstborns. In my doctoral program, I was required to go to part of the program is everybody, if you're in the program, you have to go to counseling. I didn't want to do it. I tried to fake, like get my friend, hey, sign up for me so I can just, what I decided to say, let me just focus on this. Let me see what comes out of it.
yeah.
And in the process, my therapist created not a diagnosis, but a phrase that she really understood. She said, I noticed a lot of um, firstborns of Africans, like they tend to have these huge expectations on their shoulders. I was like, oh, what do you mean? And she said it's almost like you guys are on autopilot of all the things that you're supposed to do based on conditioning from childhood. Just hearing stuff like that, I'm like, oh wow.
Mhm.
Like it's more than just, oh, this is anxiety or this is stress. It is, I feel like I have to do this because I was told several times that this is what I need to be doing, you know? And just looking at those things, like if I was with another therapist, they would have just classified it as what is this is just what it is,
Yeah.
and not focus on the root cause of the issues. And so for anyone who's listening to this, I really, really, really want you to pay attention to if you're going to go to counseling services, if you want to be a therapist, you want to be any of those kind of things, like really pay attention to the cultural things that's put you in the space that you're in right now. Because if you just focus on the symptoms alone and not address some of the cultural things that you may need to relearn and rewrite, kind of like what Comfort said about doing your own cognitive behavioral therapy, like changing how you think, things change.
Mhm.
Yeah, healing is there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I, I think that is amazing because we know that sometimes when we hear things from a doctor, from a person of authority figure in anywhere in healthcare, we're like, oh, yeah, they're absolutely right. And we also want to be mindful that in any field, things happen, and in our field, people get misdiagnosed all the time. And so there's
Yes.
that. And because some of us, depending on how we work, we have to give diagnosis within the first session versus
Hmm.
3 sessions down the line. So some clients will undershare in the first session. So we think, oh, this is the diagnosis.
Hmm.
But a month down the line, they've shared more, they're comfortable, and you're like, oh, this is not the diagnosis. So things like that. And then the other thing is that I say this all the time whenever I do speaking engagements like this. When you get a diagnosis, don't just take it and run with it.
Hmm.
You are welcome. You are allowed to ask questions. And one of the things that I do with the individuals that I work with, after our session, I'm in private practice, and sometimes I'll do contract work. And in my private practice, after our session, for the first few sessions, because intake for different providers can look different. So the first few sessions, I arrive to a diagnosis. I'll give the individual diagnosis, and I'll say, based on what you share, this is the diagnosis. If later down the line you share more, I discover more, this diagnosis can change
Hmm.
or it can look different. And I will say, is this something that, based on what you share, does this? And they're like, oh my God, I've never thought about it. And then some client will push back and say, no, I don't think this is it. And that is welcome because who know you better than you? Yes, I'm
Hmm.
a provider. I'm only going off of your subjective report to me.
Hmm.
So I encourage everyone that goes to therapy. We're talking about Africans, specifically Africans, because that becomes your medical record, and you want to know what's on there is something that your therapist have explained to you that you understand based on your communication level, based on the way in which you can comprehend. So that when you are talking to people, you're like, oh, I do have diagnosis, and it's because of da da da. And now they're able to go and explain it And that's how we continue to educate. But
Mm.
if me, the provider, I'm not educated why I have arrived to this diagnosis and I just tell you and you take it, oh, I have ADHD, I have ADHD, I have ADHD. Do you even know what it is, what it
Mm-hmm.
means?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that a lot of the work we do is in the therapy room, and
Mm-hmm.
people only see it after the person um, has left the therapy room and starts behaving, living, and responding in a certain way. That's where we get to see the work we've put in, which
Yeah.
is a. But I think you're absolutely right. We need to be mindful, careful of our own cultural stuff, um,
Yes.
and we need to know who we are.
Yes. It's big, big stuff. Yeah. So how can okay, you're saying something?
So I had to make sure I find it because I didn't want to leave people hanging. The diagnosis that I was talking about that used to be in the DSM, and I think it was the second or the third edition that used to be in the DSM, that when slaves would run away because they're being held in hostage and bondage and they would leave for a better life, they were considered mentally ill. That diagnosis were called drapetomania.
Cryptomania? That's my first time hearing this. Yeah.
And it was one of the things I learned when I got into school. And we know so many other diagnoses have been taken out of the DSM, which is why when there's something new that comes out, I try to encourage people, be careful not to take on neurodivergent disorder or this type of disorder because people are doing research, coming up with new things, and then 15 years down the line, it's taken out.
Mhm.
Conversion disorder, not the physical symptom that turn into mental, but conversion disorder for LGBTQA plus back in the day used to be in the DSM, where they used
Mhm.
to shock them to try to get the
Really
LGBTQA
keep
sex out of
out of
them,
them.
has been taken out of the DSM. We know autism used to be in there. Um, and now is considered autism spectrum. So we need to be very careful as providers, as people going to therapy, that when you're getting a diagnosis, and I tell people, if they remove ADHD from the next DSM, what happens to the person that's been going around? Do they now
Same
no longer
ADHD.
have ADHD?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And so I charge, and I will tell the people that I work with, I say, you know what? The DSM can be readily available to you depending on the research you do, depending on how you talk to your therapist, the information you can get. Just so you know that the DSM is being put in place, our diagnoses are put in place by expert people that have done so many research.
Yeah.
Are they doing extensive research on Africans? Are they Africans? Are they going on a 2 year sabbatical, staying in a nice place and then going back? Or maybe
Mhm.
they do research, they stay in the village for 2 years, but they still leave.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, really, really, really good point. Yeah, I do have to do a lot of research on drapetomania because, oh wow. Okay. Learned something new today. Um, all right. So equipped to prosper. Can you tell us about it? How we can find it, how people can get in touch? Because in all honesty, the whole point of this podcast is really to connect Africans to African therapists. And I know you have an amazing platform that will help and change a lot of things in the world. Can you tell us about it?
Yes. So Equip to Prosper is a therapy directory for Africans worldwide. We at our growing stage, we're at our infancy stage. And so I need everyone that listen to this podcast, just type in the website www.equippedtoprosper.com. And if you look into the handles of my name and all of that, you'll be able to click on the site and check it out. It's something that for a while I was like, I know I need to do something. I know I need to do something. But it was a big feat early on in my career. And the more speaking engagement I did, the more I leaned into doing it. And Equipped to Prosper, the website itself, before it became a directory, started off just as a website and me offering mental health resources to the African community that were in the diaspora. In September of 2020, a Ghanaian woman in Florida was murdered by her husband.
Mm.
There was a video prior to her being murdered that went viral. It was a video that I seen. I'd opened my Facebook page in September 2020. That video was the catalyst, and her being murdered was the catalyst for me to start the website. And so it was just a website with mental health resources, offering some coaching, and that was it. In 2023, I did a speaking engagement. I walked off stage. So many people came up to me. One specific person came up to me, and based on what they shared that day, I decided I was gonna just move from just a website to have a directory where people can find providers, because I'm just one provider. I'm only licensed in 2 states. I cannot and I do not want to work with all Africans for my own mental health. But
Yes.
I know I cannot work with everyone, but I can create a resource where everyone can get the help they need.
Mm-hmm.
So the website that was just a resource website in 2023 became a directory for Africans worldwide. And we're growing. If you know a provider that knows a provider that knows a
As a
provider,
provider.
you need to get on there. And we have so much in store for our African community. There's so much that we need to do, so much we'll be creating for Africans that will be a great resource because we need something for ourselves. And in the world where we're hated, exploited,
Mm-hmm.
yet we
Mm-hmm.
have everything. It's
Mm-hmm.
time. It's time. So
Yes.
if this is something you believe in, you are in alignment with what Dr. Timmy Laurie is doing. You're in alignment with what I'm doing. I encourage you to reach out to me. We can do something together. This is a source for Africans by Africans.
Africans. Love it, love it, love it, love it, love it. Thank you so much for coming on here. I will leave all the information for www.equip to prosper, the Instagram page. I will leave it in the comments on YouTube. And, for anybody, just check it out. Check it out. It won't hurt to have more knowledge. Knowledge is power. Okay, so thank you everyone for listening. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to the next episode of Mental Health Savage.